Around 1200 years before the birth of Christ, the Mediterranean world ended. Not slowly, not quietly, but in flames and silence. Within a single lifetime, the great palaces of Greece went dark. The Hittite Empire, which had ruled Anatolia for half a millennium, vanished from the earth. Cities that had stood for centuries were abandoned, their walls scorched, their treasuries looted, their populations scattered to the winds. The intricate web of trade and diplomacy that had connected 3 continents simply stopped functioning, as if someone had cut every thread at once. And in the Egyptian records of this catastrophe, we find a name repeated again and again: the Sea Peoples. But this name tells us almost nothing. We don't know where they came from. We don't know what they called themselves. We don't even know if they were truly a unified people at all. They appear in history as phantoms, blamed for the destruction of an entire world, yet leaving behind barely a trace of who they were or why they came. This is their story, or rather, this is the story of a world that could not survive their arrival. To understand the Sea Peoples, we must first understand what they destroyed. The late Bronze Age Mediterranean was not a collection of isolated kingdoms. It was a single, interconnected world, bound together by trade routes, diplomatic marriages, and an elaborate system of gift exchange that disguised economic necessity as royal generosity. The pharaohs of Egypt needed silver and timber from the Levant. The Hittite kings of Anatolia needed grain from Syria and copper from Cyprus. The Mycenaean palace lords of Greece needed tin from the east to mix with copper and create bronze, the metal that gave this entire age its name. Without tin, there could be no bronze. Without bronze, there could be no weapons, no tools, no prestige goods to mark the power of kings. And tin came from far away, from Afghanistan, or perhaps from the Atlantic coast of Europe, traveling along trade routes so complex that no single merchant understood the whole network. The Amarna letters, a cache of diplomatic correspondence discovered in Egypt, reveal how this system worked. Kings addressed each other as brothers, even when one was clearly more powerful than the other. They exchanged lavish gifts, carefully weighed and recorded, each present calibrated to maintain relationships without admitting outright economic dependence. A Hittite king writes to an Egyptian pharaoh, complaining that the gold statues sent as gifts were not solid gold, but merely gold-plated, a breach of trust that could destabilize their alliance. Another letter shows the king of Alatia, modern Cyprus, apologizing that he cannot send copper because his workers have died of plague. These were not mere courtesies. They were the diplomatic language of an economic system where interruption meant crisis. The wealth this system generated was staggering. At Ugarit, a port city on the Syrian coast, archaeologists have found evidence of merchants trading with partners from Mycenaean Greece to Mesopotamia. The city's archives record transactions in multiple languages and scripts. Its craftsmen worked ivory from Africa, lapis lazuli from Afghanistan, and amber from the Baltic. The palace economy redistributed these goods, employing scribes, soldiers, craftsmen, and laborers in a hierarchy so rigid that a person's profession was often determined by birth. Everyone had a place. Everyone depended on the system continuing to function. And because it had functioned for so long, people assumed it always would. This was their first mistake. Complex systems create an illusion of stability. The more parts work together, the more natural the whole seems, and the harder it becomes to imagine it could ever fail. Before World War I, European intellectuals believed that economic interdependence had made large-scale war impossible. Banks in London held investments in Berlin. Factories in France depended on coal from England. The system was too connected to break friends, and then it broke anyway, because the very complexity that created stability also created fragility. When one part failed, everything failed together. The late Bronze Age world was even more fragile, because it had no redundancy. There was one source of tin, a few sources of copper, a handful of grain-producing regions. If any of these failed, the whole system was in danger. And around 1200 BCE, many of them failed at once. But before we examine that collapse, we must ask a more basic question. When the Egyptian pharaoh Ramses III carved triumphant scenes of his victories on the walls of his mortuary temple at Medinet Habu, he claimed to have defeated invasions by land and sea. He listed the names of his enemies: Peliset, Jeker, Shekelesh, Danayan, Weshesh. He showed them in reliefs, distinct in their dress and weapons, some with feathered headdresses, others with horned helmets. He called them the peoples of the sea, and he claimed to have saved Egypt from their onslaught. But who were they really? And how much of what we know is simply what one king wanted us to believe? The problem begins with the sources themselves. Almost everything we know about the Sea Peoples comes from Egyptian records, and Egyptian records were not written to preserve objective history. They were propaganda, carved in stone to last forever, proclaiming the pharaoh's power for eternity. In Egyptian royal ideology, the king was the sole defender of order against chaos. Foreign enemies existed to be defeated. Battles existed to be won. The possibility that the pharaoh might lose, or that invaders might be refugees rather than conquerors, or that Egypt itself might be partly to blame for the crisis. None of these could be admitted in official texts. So when we read that Ramses III defeated the Sea Peoples in a great naval battle, we must ask whether this happened as described, or whether the king combined many smaller conflicts into one grand narrative, or whether the battle itself might have been less decisive than the inscriptions claim. The names themselves are mysterious. Peliset might be the Philistines, who later settled in Canaan. Shekelesh might be related to Sicily. Danayan might be connected to the Danaans, one of the Greek peoples mentioned in Homer. But these identifications are educated guesses, based on similarities in sound across thousands of years and multiple languages. We have no texts from the Sea Peoples themselves, no inscriptions in their own words, no pottery that definitively marks them as a unified group. What we have are Egyptian labels applied to enemies whose actual names and origins the Egyptians may not have known or cared to record accurately. This creates an epistemological problem. We are trying to reconstruct history from the perspective of people who wanted to forget it. The Sea Peoples, if they destroyed cities and ended dynasties, left no monuments to their victories. The civilizations they attacked stopped writing, stopped building, stopped leaving records. What survived is propaganda from the one kingdom that did not completely collapse, and even that kingdom was transformed beyond recognition. We are reading history backward through a distorted mirror, trying to see shapes in the reflection. Yet archaeology gives us clues. In the decades around 1200 BCE, new styles of pottery appear in the eastern Mediterranean. Some of this pottery resembles Mycenaean Greek designs but is cruder, as if made by people who remembered the style but no longer had access to skilled potters or palace workshops. Cremation, burials, rare in the Bronze Age Levant, become more common, suggesting the arrival of people with different funerary customs. Weapons change, too. New types of swords and spearheads appear, some with designs known from the Aegean, others entirely novel. And at many sites, we find evidence of sudden destruction. Buildings burned, walls torn down, precious objects buried in haste and never recovered. At Ugarit, the evidence is particularly haunting. The city was destroyed so quickly that clay tablets were left in the ovens where they were being baked, preserving the last messages of a dying civilization. One tablet is a letter from the king of Alasia, warning that enemy ships have been sighted at sea. Another is a desperate plea to the king of another city, begging for help because Ugarit's army has been sent away and the city is defenseless. These texts don't tell us who the attackers were. They only tell us that when the end came, it came swiftly, and no help arrived in time. But here is the troubling question. Were the sea peoples a cause of the collapse, or a symptom of it? Did they destroy the Bronze Age world, or were they simply refugees and raiders taking advantage of a world already falling apart? To answer this, we must understand that civilizational collapse is rarely caused by a single factor. It is the result of multiple stresses combining in ways that overwhelm a system's ability to adapt. And in the late Bronze Age Mediterranean, those stresses were building for decades before the sea peoples ever appeared in Egyptian records. The first stress was environmental. Tree ring data from ancient wood, preserved in bogs and archaeological sites, allows us to reconstruct past climates with remarkable precision. This data shows that the eastern Mediterranean experienced a severe drought beginning around 1200 BCE and lasting for decades. In a world where agriculture depended on rainfall and irrigation systems required constant maintenance, prolonged drought was catastrophic. Harvests failed, grain stores were depleted, famine spread, and when people are starving, they move. They abandon marginal farmland and migrate toward rivers and fertile plains. They raid neighbors who still have food. They lose faith in kings who can no longer provide for them. Climate does not determine history, but it shapes the context in which human decisions are made. And in a time of drought, those decisions become desperate. The second stress was economic. The palace economies of the Bronze Age were marvels of organization, but they were also rigid and fragile. Everything flowed through central redistribution. Scribes recorded every jar of olive oil, every ingot of copper, every ration of grain distributed to workers. This system worked brilliantly when trade routes were secure and harvests were reliable. But it had no flexibility. When the tin supply from Afghanistan was disrupted, bronze production faltered. When copper mines in Cyprus were abandoned due to unrest or resource depletion, the whole network suffered. And because the palaces had monopolized production, there was no alternative system. Independent merchants existed, but were tightly controlled. Local communities had lost the ability to be self-sufficient. When the palace system failed, there was nothing to replace it. The third stress was political. Our sources hint at internal conflicts within the great powers. The Hittite Empire was fracturing, with rival claimants to the throne and regions breaking away. In Greece, there is evidence that some Mycenaean palaces were destroyed not by foreign invaders, but by internal revolts. The administrative texts from Pylos, one of the last Greek palaces to fall, show signs of military mobilization and defensive preparations, as if the rulers knew something terrible was coming, but could not prevent it. Were these preparations against external enemies, or against their own subjects? The tablets don't say, they simply stop. mid-sentence, mid-thought, in the year the palace burned. The fourth stress was military. Warfare in the late Bronze Age followed predictable patterns. Armies were built around chariots, expensive weapons systems that required trained crews, specialized horses, and constant maintenance. They were devastating in open battle, but vulnerable to raiders who refused to fight conventionally. The palace armies were designed to fight other palace armies, not swarms of lightly armed warriors who attacked quickly and then disappeared. When the nature of warfare changed, the old military system became obsolete almost overnight. The appearance of iron weapons compounded this problem. Iron was not yet as strong as bronze, but it was far more common. A bronze sword was a precious heirloom. An iron spear could be made by any competent smith. The democratization of weapons meant that power was no longer monopolized by elites who could afford bronze. These four stresses created a perfect storm. Alone, any one of them might have been manageable. Together, they triggered cascading failures. Drought led to famine. Famine led to migration and unrest. Unrest disrupted trade routes. Disrupted trade meant no tin, no copper, no bronze. Without bronze, palace armies could not be equipped. Without effective armies, palaces could not defend themselves or suppress rebellions. And as palaces fell, the administrative systems that recorded transactions and maintained infrastructure collapsed. Scribes were no longer trained. Literacy declined. Within a generation, entire writing systems disappeared. Linear B was forgotten and not deciphered again until the 20th century. The knowledge of how to build palaces, how to organize large-scale production, how to maintain long-distance trade networks, all of this was lost. And into this chaos came the people the Egyptians called the Sea Peoples. But we must now ask a more precise question. Who exactly were they? The Egyptian sources suggest they came by sea, which implies naval capability and organization. The reliefs at Medinet Habu show them traveling with families, with ox carts loaded with possessions, which suggests migration rather than raiding. Some scholars have proposed they were Mycenaean Greeks, displaced when their own palaces collapsed, and now seeking new lands in the eastern Mediterranean. Others suggest they came from Anatolia, from the disintegrating Hittite Empire, or from the Mediterranean islands, or even from Italy. The truth is probably that the Sea Peoples were not a single people at all, but many groups, some refugees, some raiders, some opportunistic mercenaries, all moving at once as the old order disintegrated. This interpretation fits the evidence better than the idea of a coordinated invasion. The destructions attributed to the Sea Peoples happened over decades, not in a single campaign. Different sites show different patterns of destruction and abandonment. Some were burned, others simply depopulated. Some show signs of hasty fortification before the end. Others were apparently taken by surprise. This is not what we would expect from a unified military campaign. It is what we would expect from a period of general instability, where many different groups moved through the same region during the same turbulent decades. In this context, the Egyptian reliefs at Medinet Habu become less reliable as historical record and more interesting as ideological statement. Ramses III needed to be seen as the defender of Egypt. He needed to show his people that he had defeated the enemies who had destroyed the Hittites and ravaged the Levant. Whether the battles depicted actually happened as shown is less important than the fact that the pharaoh believed it was necessary to claim such victories. Egypt did survive, but barely. The kingdom never regained its earlier power. The the costs of defense, the loss of trade income, the strain on resources, all of this left Egypt diminished. And here we encounter one of the great ironies of the Sea People's story. The Egyptian texts claim Ramesses defeated them utterly. But the Papyrus Harris, an administrative document from the end of his reign, records that the pharaoh settled some of these defeated enemies in Egypt and Canaan as garrison troops and laborers. The Peliset, identified with the Philistines, were given lands along the southern Levantine coast. Other groups were integrated into Egyptian society. This does not sound like the fate of utterly defeated enemies. It sounds like a negotiated settlement where dangerous groups were given land and status in exchange for loyalty. The Egyptians claimed total victory, but they were actually accommodating the newcomers because they had no choice. The old system was broken, and even Egypt had to adapt to the new reality. To truly grasp what was lost in the Bronze Age collapse, we must understand the sophistication of the world that disappeared. This was not a primitive society, barely scratching subsistence from the earth. The palace economies of the late Bronze Age were marvels of administrative complexity that would not be matched again for over 1,000 years. At Pylos, in southern Greece, archaeologists discovered clay tablets that recorded the palace's final year of operation in extraordinary detail. These tablets list rations distributed to different categories of workers, carefully specifying quantities of grain, figs, and wine. They record inventories of bronze implements, documenting every weapon in the palace armory down to individual arrowheads. They track textile production, noting how much wool was distributed to which groups of women, how much finished cloth was produced. They even record religious offerings, specifying exactly which gods received which sacrifices and in what quantities. This level of bureaucratic control required literacy, numeracy, and an entire class of specialized administrators. The scribes who wrote these tablets were trained professionals who had spent years learning the complex linear B-writing system. They worked in a tradition that stretched back centuries, following established procedures that ensured consistency across generations. When the palace at Pylos burned, these tablets were accidentally baked hard by the fire, preserving them for modern archaeologists. But the scribes who wrote them died, and their knowledge died with them. Within a generation, no one in Greece could read Linear B. The writing system was completely forgotten, not to be deciphered again until 1952, over 3,000 years later. The loss of literacy was just one dimension of the collapse. The palace economies also controlled craft production at levels of specialization that seem remarkable even by modern standards. At Naissus on Crete, tablets record chariot workshops where different craftsmen specialized in different components. One group made wheels, another made axles, a third group made the chassis, a fourth assembled the finished chariots. This division of labor increased efficiency, but also increased vulnerability. Each specialist depended on the palace system to coordinate production and distribute resources. When the palace fell, the entire production chain collapsed. Individual craftsmen might survive, but they could no longer produce chariots without access to the full range of specialists and materials. The same vulnerability affected bronze production itself. Bronze is an alloy of copper and tin, typically in a ratio of 9 parts copper to 1 part tin. Copper was relatively common in the Bronze Age Mediterranean. Cyprus had extensive mines. The Sinai Peninsula had copper. Anatolia had copper. But tin was rare. The only significant sources were in Central Asia, possibly Afghanistan, or in the Far West, possibly Spain or Britain. This meant that tin had to travel vast distances, passing through many hands, crossing multiple political boundaries, before reaching the workshops where bronze was cast. The tin trade reveals the full extent of Bronze Age interconnection and its inherent fragility. A bronze workshop in Mycenaean Greece depended on tin that had traveled thousands of miles from its source. If any link in that chain broke, if any kingdom along the route went to war or collapsed into anarchy, if any merchant caravan was raided, the tin stopped flowing. And without tin, there could be no new bronze. Existing bronze objects could be melted down and recast, but the total supply could not increase. In a world where bronze weapons and tools were essential, this created immediate crisis. Palace armies could not be re-equipped. Farmers could not replace broken plows. The whole economy seized up. Archaeological evidence suggests this is exactly what happened in the decades around 1200 BCE. At many sites, we find hordes of broken bronze objects, apparently gathered for recycling, but never melted down. These hordes suggest a world where bronze was so valuable that even fragments were worth saving, where new bronze was unavailable, where people were desperately trying to maintain their bronze implements by recycling every scrap. This was not a world experiencing minor disruptions to trade. This was a world where the entire economic system was breaking down. The climate data reinforces this picture of cascading crisis. Dendrochronology allows scientists to reconstruct ancient climate patterns with year-by-year precision. Trees grow thicker, rings in wet years, and thinner rings in dry years. By studying trees that lived during the Late Bronze Age, scientists have identified a severe drought that began around 1200 BCE and lasted for several decades. This was not a single bad harvest year. This was a generation-long crisis that would have tested any agricultural society to its limits. In the Bronze Age Mediterranean, where most agriculture depended on rainfall rather than irrigation, prolonged drought was catastrophic. The great river valleys of Egypt and Mesopotamia had irrigation systems that could partially buffer against drought, though even they suffered when water levels dropped. But in Greece, in Anatolia, in much of the Levant, farming depended entirely on winter rains. When those rains failed year after year, harvests collapsed, grain stores were depleted, famine spread. And when people are starving, they make desperate decisions. They abandon marginal lands and migrate toward more fertile regions. They raid neighbors who still have food. They lose faith in rulers who cannot provide for them. They become willing to take enormous risks, to travel great distances, to fight for survival. This climate-driven migration and conflict would have disrupted trade routes at exactly the moment when those routes were already stressed by political instability. The Hittite Empire, which controlled much of Anatolia and northern Syria, was fragmenting in the late 13th century BCE. Letters from the Hittite capital show the empire struggling with succession disputes, rebellions, and attacks from groups the Hittites called the Kaska people, who lived in the mountains of northern Anatolia. The last Hittite kings sent increasingly desperate letters to other rulers, requesting grain shipments to feed their starving population. One letter records that the king sent a ship to Egypt to beg for emergency grain supplies. This was not normal diplomatic gift exchange. This was a kingdom on the edge of starvation, unable to feed its own people, dependent on foreign aid to survive. And then the letters stop. The Hittite capital of Hattusa was destroyed around 1200 BCE. The site shows evidence of deliberate demolition, with walls torn down and buildings systematically wrecked. Whether this destruction was caused by foreign invaders, internal rebels, or the Hittites themselves abandoning and destroying their capital is unclear. What is clear is that the Hittite Empire, which had been one of the great powers of the Bronze Age for over 4 centuries, ceased to exist within a single generation. The administrative apparatus vanished. The writing system largely disappeared. The political unity of Anatolia fragmented into dozens of small kingdoms. A sophisticated imperial system that had governed millions of people simply dissolved. The collapse of the Hittite Empire had immediate consequences for the entire eastern Mediterranean. The Hittites had been a stabilizing force, maintaining trade routes, enforcing treaties, providing a counterbalance to Egyptian power. With the Hittites gone, regional conflicts intensified. Small kingdoms that had been Hittite vassals now fought each other for territory and resources. Refugees from the collapsed empire flooded into Syria and the Levant, destabilizing those regions in turn. And the trade routes that had run through Hittite territory, carrying tin and other goods from Central Asia to the Mediterranean, were severed. The entire economic system of the eastern Mediterranean depended on those routes, and now they were gone. In Greece, the situation was equally dire. The Mycenaean palaces began to show signs of stress in the late 13th century BCE. At some sites, massive fortification walls were built or reinforced, suggesting the rulers feared attack. At Mycenae itself, the citadel walls were extended to enclose an underground cistern, ensuring water supply during a siege. At Tiryns, another major palace, similar defensive works were undertaken. These were enormous construction projects, requiring vast amounts of labor and resources. They suggest rulers who were genuinely frightened, who believed they needed to prepare for catastrophic attack. And the attack came, though we cannot be certain who the attackers were. Palace after palace was destroyed in the decades around 1200 BCE. Pylos burned. Mycenae survived but was greatly reduced. Tiryns was damaged. Thebes was destroyed. The palace at Gila, a massive fortified site in central Greece, was abandoned. Some of these destructions show signs of hasty preparation, with valuables buried in the hope of future recovery. Many of these hoards were never retrieved, suggesting the people who buried them never returned or never survived to return. Other sites show evidence of violent destruction, with skeletons of defenders found in the ruins, cut down where they fought. But here is the crucial point. Not all these destructions happened at the same time or in the same way. They were spread over several decades, from roughly 1230 to 1180 BCE. Some sites were destroyed and then briefly reoccupied before being abandoned. Others were destroyed multiple times. The pattern is not consistent with a single invasion by a unified force. It is consistent with a period of general instability, where multiple groups were attacking, where internal revolts were occurring, where the palace system was under pressure from many directions at once. Who were these attackers? The traditional answer is the Sea Peoples, the mysterious invaders who supposedly swept through the Mediterranean, destroying everything in their path. But the archaeological evidence increasingly suggests a more complex picture. Some of the attackers may have been external enemies, but some were probably internal rebels, subjects of the palaces who rose up against their rulers. Some may have been neighboring kingdoms, taking advantage of Mycenaean weakness. Some may have been raiders from across the Aegean. And some of the destruction may have been accidental or self-inflicted, palaces burned during civil conflicts, or deliberately destroyed by their own rulers during evacuations. The DNA evidence adds another layer of complexity. Ancient DNA extracted from skeletons buried in the Aegean region during the Late Bronze Age and the subsequent Early Iron Age shows genetic continuity. The people living in Greece after the collapse were largely descended from the people who lived there before the collapse. There was no massive population replacement. There was no genetic evidence of a huge influx of foreigners overwhelming the local population. This does not mean no one migrated into or out of Greece during this period. It simply means that whatever migrations occurred did not completely replace the existing population. This genetic continuity is important because it challenges the simple invasion narrative. If the Sea Peoples were foreign invaders who destroyed Mycenaean civilization, we would expect to see significant genetic change in the population. Instead, we see essential continuity, which suggests that much of the violence and destruction came from within Mycenaean society itself, or that migrants were absorbed into the existing population rather than replacing it. Isotope analysis can show where individuals were born by analyzing the chemical composition of their teeth, which form in childhood and preserve a record of the local environment. Studies using this technique on Bronze Age and Iron Age skeletons show that some individuals were indeed migrants, born in one region and buried in another. But again, these migrants appear to have been individuals or small groups integrating into existing communities, not massive armies sweeping through and destroying everything. So if the traditional Sea Peoples narrative of foreign invasion is too simple, what actually happened? The emerging consensus among historians and archaeologists is that the Bronze Age collapse was a perfect storm of interconnected crises. Climate stress caused droughts and famines, which triggered migrations and conflicts. Economic interdependence meant that when trade routes were disrupted, the effects cascaded through the entire system. Political instability in one region spread to others. Military innovations, particularly the spread of iron weapons and new infantry tactics, undermined the chariot-based palace armies, and internal social tensions, which had probably been building for generations under the rigid palace hierarchies, exploded into revolts and civil wars. The Sea Peoples, in this interpretation, were not the cause of the collapse, but a symptom of it. They were the people on the move during a time of crisis, refugees and raiders and migrants, all mixed together, given a collective name by the Egyptians, but actually representing many different groups, with many different origins and motivations. Some were probably Mycenaean Greeks, fleeing the destruction of their own palaces. Some were probably from Anatolia, displaced by the collapse of the Hittite Empire. Some were probably from the Mediterranean islands, driven from their homes by drought and famine. Some were probably pirates and mercenaries, taking advantage of the chaos. They were not a unified force with a coordinated strategy. They were the human debris of a collapsing world. Egypt encountered these groups because Egypt was one of the few Bronze Age kingdoms that did not completely collapse. The reasons for Egyptian resilience are complex, but geography played a major role. Egypt's agriculture depended on the Nile flood, which was fed by monsoon rains in the highlands of Ethiopia. Even when the eastern Mediterranean was experiencing severe drought, the Nile continued to flood, providing water for irrigation and ensuring relatively stable harvests. This agricultural foundation allowed Egypt to maintain its administrative structure and military capacity even as neighboring kingdoms were falling apart. But Egypt did not escape unscathed. The reign of Ramses III was marked by repeated conflicts and increasing internal stress. The pharaoh fought battles against enemies he called the Libyans, the Sea Peoples, and various other groups. The great inscriptions at Medinet Habu depict these conflicts in heroic terms, showing the pharaoh triumphant over hordes of enemies. The reliefs show naval battles with ships grappling and warriors fighting hand to hand. They show land battles with chariots and infantry clashing. They show lines of prisoners being led before the pharaoh, their distinctive dress and weapons carefully depicted. These reliefs are magnificent works of art and propaganda, but they are problematic as historical sources. Egyptian royal ideology required the pharaoh to be shown as victorious, as the sole defender of cosmic order against chaos. To depict the pharaoh as defeated or even struggling would have been ideologically impossible. So the reliefs showed decisive victories, enemies crushed, Egypt triumphant. But other evidence suggests the reality was more ambiguous. The papyrus Harris records that the pharaoh settled groups of defeated sea peoples as garrison troops in Egypt and the Levant. If these enemies had been utterly destroyed, why were they being integrated into the Egyptian military and settled on Egyptian territory? The answer seems to be that Ramses III fought the sea peoples to a standstill rather than defeating them decisively. Egypt survived, but only by accommodating some of the newcomers, giving them land and status in exchange for military service. This was not the crushing victory depicted on the temple walls. It was a negotiated settlement, a compromise that allowed both Egypt and the Sea Peoples to survive. And while this settlement preserved Egyptian independence, it also showed how much Egypt had weakened. The economic costs of these conflicts were enormous. The papyrus Harris also records the temple donations made by Ramses III during his reign, documenting vast quantities of gold, silver, copper, grain, cattle, and land given to the gods. These donations were meant to demonstrate the pharaoh's piety and generosity, but they also show the strain on the Egyptian economy. The resources devoted to temples and military defense were not available for maintaining infrastructure, supporting trade, or providing for the general population. Egypt survived the Bronze Age collapse, but as a diminished power, never again achieving the wealth and influence it had enjoyed during the New Kingdom. In the Levant, the picture is one of wholesale transformation. The great coastal cities like Ugarit were destroyed and never rebuilt. The palace-centered economies disappeared completely. But life did not end. New settlements appeared, smaller and simpler than the Bronze Age cities, but viable nonetheless. Some of these new settlements show cultural continuities with the Bronze Age, suggesting they were founded by survivors of the destroyed cities. Others show new cultural elements, particularly pottery styles and architectural features reminiscent of the Aegean world, suggesting the presence of migrants from Greece or the islands. The Philistines, who settled along the southern coast of Canaan, are the best documented example of this cultural mixing. The archaeological sites identified as Philistine, particularly Ashkelon, Ekron, and Ashdod, show a distinctive material culture in the decades after 1200 BCE. The pottery includes styles clearly derived from Mycenaean Greek prototypes, but locally made rather than imported. The architecture includes features known from the Aegean, but adapted to local conditions. Pig bones appear in significant quantities in Philistine sites, indicating a dietary preference rare in the Levant, but common in the Aegean. All this evidence suggests that the Philistines had origins in or connections to the Greek world. But the Philistines were not simply transplanted Greeks. Within a few generations, their material culture shows increasing influence from local Canaanite traditions. Their pottery styles evolved away from Aegean prototypes toward forms more typical of the Levant. They adopted Semitic names and worshipped gods whose names appear to be Semitic. They became part of the cultural landscape of QAnon, contributing to it, but also being shaped by it. By the time they appear in the Hebrew Bible as enemies of the Israelites, several centuries after their initial settlement, they were thoroughly integrated into Levantine culture. Their Aegean origins, if they had Aegean origins, were probably forgotten or irrelevant. This pattern of initial distinctiveness followed by gradual integration appears throughout the post-collapse Eastern Mediterranean. The Sea Peoples, whoever they were originally, did not maintain separate identities for long. They merged with local populations, adopted local customs, forgot their origins. Within a few generations, they were simply part of the new Iron Age world, indistinguishable from the descendants of Bronze Age populations. This rapid cultural assimilation suggests that the Sea Peoples were never particularly numerous, that they were absorbed into much larger existing populations, that their impact was catalytic rather than transformative in a demographic sense, but their impact was transformative in other ways. The collapse of the palace economies created a power vacuum that allowed new forms of social organization to develop. In the Levant, tribal federations and small kingdoms replaced the Bronze Age city-states. In Greece, the polis system began to evolve, though it would not reach its classical form for centuries. In Phoenicia, independent city-states centered on maritime trade emerged as the dominant powers. These new political formations were more flexible and adaptive than the rigid palace hierarchies they replaced. They could survive the loss of individual cities or leaders. They could respond more quickly to changing conditions. They were, in a sense, better adapted to survive in a world of instability and limited resources. The spread of iron technology was both cause and consequence of this political transformation. Iron ore is far more common than copper or tin. It can be found in most regions, making societies less dependent on long-distance trade for essential metals. But iron is harder to work than bronze. It requires higher temperatures to smelt and more skill to forge into useful objects. Bronze Age societies had known about iron for centuries, but used it only for ceremonial objects and jewelry, not for practical tools and weapons. The techniques for producing large quantities of iron implements had to be developed gradually, probably in Anatolia or the Caucasus, and then spread westward. The collapse of the Bronze Age palace economies may have accelerated this process. When bronze became scarce due to disrupted trade routes, smiths had incentive to experiment with iron as a substitute. When centralized palace control over metal production broke down, individual craftsmen gained more freedom to innovate. When the monopoly of palace armories on bronze weapons ended, communities sought alternative ways to arm themselves, and iron provided that alternative. By 1100 BCE, iron tools and weapons were becoming common throughout the Eastern Mediterranean. By 1000 BCE, iron had largely replaced bronze for everyday purposes, though bronze continued to be used for prestige objects and ceremonial items. The democratization of metal production had profound social consequences. Bronze Age palace economies had controlled metal production tightly, treating bronze as a strategic resource to be carefully managed and distributed. But iron was too common to monopolize in the same way. Local smiths could obtain ore from nearby sources and produce tools without palace supervision. This made communities more self-sufficient, less dependent on palace redistribution, more capable of independent action. It also made warfare more accessible. A bronze sword was an aristocratic weapon, expensive to produce and rare enough to be a mark of status. An iron spear was a common weapon that any farmer or herder could afford. The shift from bronze to iron was partly a shift from aristocratic to more egalitarian forms of warfare. From chariot armies controlled by elites to infantry militias drawn from broader populations. Literacy followed a similar pattern of initial loss, followed by eventual democratization. The complex syllabic writing systems of the Bronze Age palaces, Linear B in Greece and hieroglyphic Luwian in Anatolia, disappeared with the palaces. These scripts required years of training to master and were used exclusively for administrative purposes by palace bureaucracies. When the palaces fell, the scribal tradition collapsed. In Greece, literacy vanished almost completely for several centuries, the period historians call the Greek Dark Age. What survived were oral traditions, epic poetry, and genealogies passed down by bards who performed for aristocratic audiences. The Iliad and the Odyssey, though composed or compiled centuries after the Bronze Age collapse, preserve memories of Mycenaean civilization filtered through generations of oral transmission. But in the Levant, a revolutionary development occurred. The Phoenician cities developed alphabetic writing, a system so simple that it could be learned in days rather than years, so flexible that it could represent any language, so practical that it could be used for commerce as well as administration. The Phoenician alphabet had only 22 characters, each representing a consonant sound. This was a fraction of the hundreds of signs needed to write in cuneiform or hieroglyphics. The simplicity of the alphabet made literacy accessible beyond the scribal elite. Merchants could learn to write to keep their own records. Ordinary people could learn to read if they had reason to. This democratization of literacy would eventually have revolutionary consequences, enabling new forms of literature, law, philosophy, and religion. The Hebrew Bible, the Greek philosophical texts, the Roman legal codes, all of these were only possible because alphabetic writing made literacy widespread. The Phoenicians themselves exemplify the kind of society that emerged from the Bronze Age collapse. They were never unified into an empire. They remained independent city-states, Tyre and Sidon and Byblos and others, competing with each other economically but cooperating when threatened by external powers. They were primarily maritime traders, building on Bronze Age shipping traditions but expanding their range far beyond what the Bronze Age powers had attempted. Phoenician merchants traveled throughout the Mediterranean, establishing trading posts and colonies from Cyprus to Spain. They brought Eastern Mediterranean goods to the Western Mediterranean and returned with tin, silver, and other metals. They became the middlemen of the Iron Age Mediterranean, filling the niche left vacant by the collapse of Bronze Age trade networks. The Phoenicians succeeded where the Bronze Age palace economies had failed, precisely because they were decentralized and flexible. A Phoenician merchant was an independent operator, not a palace official following bureaucratic procedures. If one trade route became dangerous, he could try another. If one market collapsed, he could seek others. If one city was attacked, the others continued functioning. The Phoenician system had redundancy, something the Bronze Age palace economies had lacked. And this redundancy made it resilient, capable of surviving disruptions that would have destroyed a more centralized system. This is perhaps the most important lesson of the Bronze Age collapse. Centralization and integration create efficiency and enable impressive achievements. The Bronze Age palaces built monumental architecture, maintained complex trade networks, organized production on a scale not seen again for over a millennium. But centralization and integration also create vulnerability. When the system works, it works brilliantly. When it fails catastrophically. There is no middle ground, no gradual decline. The system holds together until it doesn't, and then it collapses all at once. The modern world faces similar trade-offs. Our global economy is far more integrated than the Bronze Age Mediterranean ever was. Supply chains span the entire planet. Disruption in one region can have immediate consequences everywhere else. The COVID pandemic demonstrated this vividly, as lockdowns in China disrupted manufacturing worldwide, as closed borders interrupted supply chains, as the interconnected global system proved far more fragile than most people had assumed. Climate change threatens agricultural production in ways analogous to the Bronze Age drought. Resource depletion, particularly of rare earth elements essential for modern technology, creates vulnerabilities similar to Bronze Age dependence on tin. Political instability, from failed states to great power rivalries, threatens the stability required for international trade. We like to think we are more resilient than the Bronze Age civilizations, that our technology and our knowledge make us invulnerable to the kind of collapse they experienced. But the Bronze Age peoples probably felt the same way. They had achieved things their ancestors could never have imagined. They had built palaces that reached toward the sky. They had created trade networks that connected distant continents. They had developed writing systems and administrative techniques of remarkable sophistication. They could not imagine it all ending. But it did end, and it ended quickly, within a single generation in many places. The difference, perhaps, is that we know collapse is possible because we have historical examples to learn from. The Bronze Age peoples did not. They had no precedent for the kind of systemic failure they experienced. We do. We can study the Bronze Age collapse, and the fall of Rome, and the Maya collapse, and dozens of other historical examples of civilizational failure. We can identify the warning signs: climate stress, resource depletion, economic inequality, political fragmentation, military overextension. We can, in theory, take action to address these problems before they become catastrophic. But knowledge does not guarantee action. The Bronze Age rulers probably knew their kingdoms faced serious problems. The Hittite letters requesting grain shipments show awareness of crisis. The massive fortification walls around Greek palaces show preparation for disaster. But knowing a problem exists and solving it are different things. The systemic stresses that destroyed Bronze Age civilization were deeply embedded in the structure of their societies. Climate cannot be controlled. Trade routes depend on stability in regions beyond any one kingdom's control. Economic systems are complex and resistant to deliberate reform. Military threats must be addressed even when defense is economically ruinous. The Sea Peoples were blamed for the Bronze Age collapse because blaming external enemies is easier than confronting systemic problems. Ramses III could depict himself as the heroic defender of Egypt against foreign invaders. He could not depict himself as the administrator struggling to reform an unsustainable economic system, or the leader unable to prevent climate-driven famine. External enemies can be fought and, in theory, defeated. Systemic problems require fundamental changes that threaten established interests and require collective action that is difficult to coordinate. This is why the Sea Peoples remain useful, even as our understanding of the Bronze Age collapse has become more sophisticated. They represent the human face of catastrophe, the visible actors in a drama driven by invisible forces. We can imagine them, even if we cannot name them. We can picture ships appearing on the horizon, warriors with strange weapons and unfamiliar dress, refugees fleeing burning cities. These images are tangible in a way that climate data and economic analysis are not. They give us a narrative we can follow, characters we can identify with or against, a story that has beginning and middle and end. And there is value in that narrative, even if it is simplified. History is not just data, it is story. It is the attempt to make sense of the past in human terms, to understand not just what happened, but what it meant to the people who lived through it. The Sea Peoples, nameless as they are, help us imagine what the Bronze Age collapse must have felt like to those who experienced it. They help us understand the fear, the confusion, the desperate attempts to survive in a world that was falling apart. They give us access to the human dimension of catastrophe that statistics alone cannot provide. But we must also remember the limits of narrative. The Sea People's story, as preserved in Egyptian propaganda and elaborated by modern scholars, is not the whole truth. It is one perspective on complex events, a perspective shaped by the biases and limitations of our sources. The people we call the Sea Peoples had their own perspectives, their own stories, their own reasons for moving and fighting and settling where they did. Those stories are lost, silenced by the collapse of the writing systems that might have recorded them, forgotten in the generations of oral tradition that could not preserve them across 3 millennia. What we are left with is fragments, Egyptian inscriptions that exaggerate victories and simplify enemies, archaeological remains that show destruction and cultural change but cannot explain motivation, genetic and isotope data that reveals population movement but not the human experiences of migration. We piece these fragments together into narratives that make sense to us, that fit our understanding of how civilizations work and why they fail. But we must hold these narratives lightly, acknowledging that they are interpretations rather than established facts, reconstructions rather than recordings. The mystery of the Sea Peoples is therefore both historical and epistemological. It is the mystery of who they were and where they came from, questions we may never answer definitively. But it is also the mystery of how we know anything about the past, how we construct narratives from fragments, how we distinguish fact from interpretation, how we acknowledge uncertainty while still making historical claims. The Sea Peoples force us to confront the limits of historical knowledge, to admit that some things are unknowable, that the past does not always yield its secrets, no matter how sophisticated our methods become. And perhaps there is wisdom in that acknowledgement. In an age that values certainty, that expects definitive answers, that treats ambiguity as a problem to be solved, the Sea Peoples remind us that uncertainty is sometimes the only honest position. We do not know who they were. We probably never will know, but we can still learn from them, from their role in one of history's greatest catastrophes, from the world they helped destroy and the world they helped create. We can learn about resilience and fragility, about the unintended consequences of complex systems, about the human capacity for survival in the face of overwhelming crises. The world they knew ended. The palaces burned. The trade routes fell silent. The writing systems were forgotten. But people survived. They adapted. They rebuilt. They created something new from the ruins of the old. The Iron Age Mediterranean that emerged from the Bronze Age collapse was poorer in material terms, simpler in organization, smaller in scale, but it was also more dynamic, more innovative, more capable of change. The seeds of classical civilization, of democracy and philosophy and literature were planted in the ruins of the Bronze Age world. The catastrophe that destroyed one age made possible the birth of another. And so the Sea Peoples stand at a hinge of history, at the moment when one world ended and another began. They were there, whoever they were, participants in transformation, agents and victims of change. They destroyed and they built. They ended and they began. They had names we have lost, stories we will never hear, lives we can barely imagine. But they were human, as we are human. They faced crisis, as we may face crisis. They made choices, as we must make choices. They survived or they perished, and in either case, they shaped the world that came after them. We call them the Sea Peoples because we have no other name, because the name they knew themselves by is lost in the silence of collapsed civilizations and forgotten languages. But they were not merely destroyers, not merely invaders, not merely the enemy. They were people responding to catastrophe in human ways, trying to survive, trying to find new homes, trying to make sense of a world that no longer made sense. And in their struggle, in their migrations and their settlements and their adaptations, they helped create the Iron Age world from which our own world eventually emerged. They are our ancestors in culture, if not in blood, participants in the long human story of crisis and survival, destruction and creation, ending and beginning. The Bronze Age ended. The Iron Age began. And in between, in that terrible transition, the people we call the Sea Peoples played their part, nameless but not forgotten, mysterious but not unknowable, enemies to some but human to all. They teach us that civilizations are fragile, that complexity creates vulnerability, that the center cannot always hold. But they also teach us that humanity endures, that from ruins new worlds emerge, that endings are also beginnings. The story of the Sea Peoples is the story of collapse and survival, of catastrophe and resilience, of the death of one world and the birth of another. It is a story without a certain ending, because we still do not know who they were. But it is a story worth telling, worth learning from, worth remembering, because it is fundamentally a human story, and we are human still.